morning, everybody. I'm going to be talking about some dirty words this morning. So it's always unnerving giving this talk because VCs don't really like, and ecosystem players don't really like to hear words like government or public sector. And I think when I speak to founders and VCs and ecosystem players alike, all they want from government is for government to just get out of the way and let them work and stop being such an obstruction. And I'm going to try and make a case in the next 10 minutes for why, when we get the opportunity to engage with government, that perhaps we should take that opportunity to see how we can work collaboratively through public-private partnerships to enhance our ecosystems. I'll start by talking a bit about myself. And then go on to why I think it's important for us as we scale our companies and as we raise capital for our venture capital companies to also start thinking about the roles that government could play. So a bit about me. I actually started off as when I introduce myself as a doctor, people tend to think that I'm sort of a doctor of finance or a doctor of economics. I actually started off as like a medical doctor, like the type that gives injections. I quickly realized that that wasn't for me. I moved on to build a healthcare company in Nigeria doing emergency services. I then decided that I wanted to become an LP in somebody's fund, a friend of mine, but then he had a family emergency and had to leave the fund, so I ended up as a GP, and since then I've raised 2 subsequent funds, really focusing on healthcare and fintech. So it's a thesis-focused fund. We do early-stage investments, pre-Series A across Africa. So in the next few minutes, I'll be talking about why tech, because that's important. When you're speaking to policymakers, particularly in Nigeria and South Africa, the government has typically been focused on extractive industries. They want more investment in oil and gas. They want to help people in mining, and they don't really understand tech. So making a case for technology is important. And then why partnering with the public sector? Why do they need to be involved at all? Those are the 2 main questions I'll be answering. So why tech? If we look around this room, almost every single thing that we see is a product of innovation. And innovation means growth, it means prosperity, and it means opportunity for what is the world's poorest continent. When we look at the US economy, the most successful economy in the world, arguably, VC has played a massive role. VC-backed companies have played an important role in the US economy, and over the past 20 years, they've been a prime driver of economic growth and private sector employment. 20% of the largest 300 US public firms would have not existed without venture capital. And VC-backed firms account for 41% of US market capitalization. We had a long conversation in the conference before this around the relationship between the Johannesburg Stock Exchange and our startups. And none of the startups or the VCs that backed them wanted the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, whereas almost half of the US stock exchange are tech companies. And the United States dominates the global software and tech industry. Philadelphia received more money in terms of venture capital than New York City got more venture capital than China. Los Angeles in California, not talking about San Francisco, not talking about San Diego, just Los Angeles in California raised more capital. Startups in Los Angeles raised more capital than startups in Africa, Australia, and South America combined. Still asking why tech? It promotes innovation. It improves the absorptive capacity of our universities. It creates jobs, which are sorely needed in both Nigeria, where I come from, and South Africa, where we are now, as well as encouraging wealth creation. In 2008, venture-backed companies, employed more than 12 million people and generated nearly 3 trillion in revenue. Even if you combine the entire GDP of Nigeria and South Africa, you would not get $3 trillion in revenue. And imagine how much an extra 12 million jobs would make to both of our, what a difference it would make to both of our economies. Respectively, these figures accounted for 11% of private sector employment and represented the equivalent to almost a quarter of GDP in the US. It creates jobs, it adds significant capitalization to our stock exchange, and really lifts people out of poverty. Now, why should we be collaborating with the private sector? Why can't we do all of this? I mean, we have people in the room from corporates, we have people in the room from ecosystem architects, we have people in the room from funding organizations, and we have founders. Why can't we do this all on our own? Why do we need government? So I'll just spend the last few minutes talking about some of the ways that the US government has helped the tech industry. So number one, research and development. The entire internet was actually developed as an offshoot of a Pentagon-backed project, which was fully funded by the United States. If you look at the US funding for research, which is an important sort of precursor to any tech company, you find that the US government, in terms of R&D funding, provides almost half of that funding for the whole of America. Another way that the government should be participating and helping us is through funding of public universities. I work for South Africa because I don't know how well the public university system is funded here, but definitely in Nigeria, it leaves a lot to be desired. And according to an MIT study, technology that was developed at universities and then licensed to industry created almost $400 billion in GDP and created 3 million jobs. So simply by funding universities better, the government can enhance the tech industry. The third one is actually through loans and grants. Now, nobody likes government money particularly, and a lot of people wouldn't want government money in their companies, but let's have a look at the data. Google's core algorithm, its partner on a PhD project in a publicly funded university, Google's core algorithm was actually developed with a National Science Foundation grant. Tesla received a loan of almost $500 million from the Government Department of Energy, which helped him at an important time and de-risked further private sector investments. A really, really good book by a lady called Mariana Mazzucato, it's called The Entrepreneurial State, calculates that US government agencies have provided roughly a quarter of funding for early stage tech companies. And in my industry, healthcare, 75% of new molecular entities, so new drugs, have been discovered by publicly funded labs or government agencies. So people ask me, why aren't we backing new drugs out of Africa? And I ask, you know, how many PhD students do we produce in the sciences? What's the level of government investment in our universities? Why are diseases that we typically suffer from in Africa, like sickle cell anemia, like tuberculosis, particularly underfunded compared to, like even malaria, compared to those that affect Western countries? It's because we're not having the right level of public sector investment in the early stages. Even the Human Genome Project, mapping our entire genome, which eventually led to the mRNA vaccine, which is the reason why a lot of people across the world are still alive today, was fully funded by the American government to the tune of $4 billion. And even the Moderna vaccine itself was a result of a $25 million government grant. So we've discussed loans and grants, but we haven't actually spoken straight up government subsidies. Amazon has received $3.5 billion in subsidy. Tesla has received $2.5 billion in subsidy. Apple has received $1.8 billion in subsidy. Google has received $1 billion in subsidy. Facebook and Microsoft have gotten $800 million in subsidies. Imagine if our governments were doing 10% or even 1% of that for our startup community. And the government as customers. that's one thing that I think we shy away from, because no startup wants to work with government. But actually, I don't know if anybody recalls Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates and I think it was Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates fighting over this government. It was live on Twitter, arguing over this government contract. And I think Donald Trump was in the mix saying that Jeff Bezos shouldn't get it, and Jeff Bezos felt it is still a lawsuit till today. So if big men like Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates are still fighting over government contracts, then definitely the government is an important customer for us. SpaceX, for instance, which is Elon Musk's space exploration company, exists because of government contracts. Until Starlink came out, government was practically the only customer. And he'll be arguing with us as if we don't know what we are doing, or he's the only rich person. But actually, a lot of the money came from government. So we must engage. The last thing I wanted to speak about was health tech. Babylon Health, one of the first tech unicorns in health tech, got its unicorn status because of an NHS contract. Zipline, which is more familiar to us in Africa, started its business off the back of Rwandan government contract. So what's my point, really? I'd like us to think of the biggest venture capital firms that we know. When we think of Africa, perhaps we think of Launch Africa, we might think of Capital, we might think of Algebra Ventures. When we think about America, we think about Sequoia Capital, we think about Tiger Global, we think about SoftBank, we think about Greycroft. But if we want to tell ourselves the truth, as it's quiet now in this room, if VC powers the US economy, then the US taxpayer powers technology funding. And the LPs that have contributed the most to technology across the world are not any of these venture capital firms. US taxpayers are the world's biggest LPs. And the entire technology ecosystem has been built on their backs. And in Africa, I think it's something that we can learn from. So I'm not going to go over this. Why now? Because we know the numbers from the African ecosystem. So we know that African tech is growing. We know that this is a great time to put money into African tech. We also know that in Singapore, the venture capital per capita, so the amount of venture capital for each person is $1,000. So each person, if you were to divide the total amount of venture capital in Singapore by each person, you get about $1,000. If you're to divide the amount of venture capital in Africa by each person, you'd get $6. But Singapore has only produced 8 unicorns. And Africa has also produced 8 unicorns, which means that there's a huge arbitrage opportunity, comparative and competitive advantage for investing in African tech. Because African investments, or investing in Africa, is where capital does a lot more with a lot less. We contribute 15% of the global population, yet we only receive 1% of global investment flows. But look what we've built with it. So this is a huge opportunity. I'm going to skip to my last slide because I know I've run out of time. So I've tried to answer 3 questions. Why tech? The answer is easy. It generates jobs, it grows GDP, it creates prosperity, and it drives our influence and power. If we as Africans are producing the new software, the newest drugs, the newest innovations, then we can enter rooms at the United Nations, we can enter rooms at the G7, we can negotiate better on behalf of the people at the continent at the tables that matter in the world. But the reason why we have very little negotiating power now is because they feel that we're not bringing anything to the table. If we are bringing and producing technology that the world needs, then it gives us more influence and power in the world. Why public sector partnerships? Because the public sector powers the US economy through research and development, funding public universities, being a massive customer, and grants, loans, and subsidies. And our governments should be looking to replicate that. And when we do have the opportunity to engage, we should engage with them because we know that this works. And why now? Because African tech is booming. We have a competitive and comparative advantage over the rest of the world in technology. And this is an area where we can and win. I really, really, really believe passionately that technology and innovation is really a huge of what it will take to build the Africa of our dreams. And I believe that that Africa is just around the corner. Thank you so much.
Dr. Brown, that was amazing. I just wanted to find out, are there any questions from our audience, just so we can interrogate any of those ideas you've got over there? Hands up, any questions? We've got one over here, if we can get a mic. Yeah, if we could please take that mic.
Thank you. That was a phenomenal presentation. I'm very excited to see it. I work with pension funds and other infrastructure institutional investors, and we've been investing into private equity for a while, and we're looking at venture capital. Obviously, getting through everybody's mandates, it's really difficult. What recommendations would you make for pension fund and other, medical aids and people like that who are investing their first time into venture capital? Obviously, before we've been investing into tech, but the question is, how do we handle investing to really, really highly risky assets where you won't be able to invest that much? What other recommendations would you make for us to be able to push this as an asset class in the investments that we are making over the next couple of years?
My mic? Okay, perfect. So I think definitely for pension funds in Nigeria, it's the same problem. And I always say, it's very, there was a civil war in Nigeria, and pension funds are holding the money of people that fought in the civil war. So it's not easy to go and put it into a risky asset, right? But I think the first step would be a more fund of funds approach. So I would say not attempting to do direct investments until you've built up the team internally to be able to do that, and investing in fund managers that have a track record of investing and giving a certain return to investors over time. I would say also in terms of selling it internally, I think being able to sell the exponential sort of return that you can get in venture, as opposed to government treasury bills and lower risk assets that produce lower risk returns. Obviously, a few years ago, that would have been an easier sell. Again, I haven't really studied South Africa, but in Nigeria, the central bank is actually raising rates. So it's a harder sell now. The hurdle rates are actually higher. But definitely, when those rates start to come down again, as they inevitably will, venture capital now becomes one of the really only asset classes where you can get those supernormal alpha type returns, as opposed to the typical returns that you get from government treasury bills or from real estate or from other asset classes. So that's the second thing. And I would say really around what the last panel was speaking about learning and innovation, particularly in the area of fintech. The pension funds, the large banks, they're always in search of how to do things better, whether it's treasury management, whether it's sort of for the medical aid, whether it's handling claims better, whether it's making their operations more efficient. And the best way to be able to sort of absorb all of that innovation that's going on is actually to invest in it and really understand it from being inside those companies in one way or the other. So I would say that, yeah, 3 things that come to the top of my head are talking about returns, number 1, and not ordinary returns, but supernormal alpha type returns. Number 2, a fund of funds approach with tried and tested fund managers that have a track record. And then number 3, the absorptive capacity of your institution actually to be able to, to use those investments to innovate internally. Thank you.